I started working at Armstrong's, well it was AAV in those days, and I started working in 1975. I'd been running a little 4-track studio of my own in Tasmania, and I decided I wanted to work in at the big end of the market. So I came over here to look for a job. I'd sent them a demo tape from Hobart, and I got a positive response to that, along the lines of, look, if you're ever in Melbourne, come and see us and we'll have a chat. And that was enough for me. I just got in the car and moved to Melbourne. And when I got here, I'd been talking to Phil Webster, who was manager of the voiceover studio at that time.
Yep.
And he was very apologetic that he wouldn't be able to give me the time that he had indicated that he might, to talk to me about how we might do something together.
Yep.
Because they were currently in the throes of putting together this radio station, and he suggested that I contact him again in a month or 6 weeks, and I sort of went back to where I was staying, thinking I'd blown everything. Turns out it was Radio 3EA, which was ethnic radio. And it was an experimental station. It was set up by the Whitlam government. It was the forerunner of SBS. So.
And that operated from what is now Studio 3.
Yeah.
Or what became Studio 3.
That's right. Phil Webster rang me, and by the time I got back to where I was staying, there was a message to call him back, and he said, "Would you be interested in this radio thing that we're putting together?" And naturally, I said yes, because I just wanted a foot in the door, and this was it. And so I immediately went back in and saw him and was introduced to Bill Armstrong. Long story short, I got home at 3 o'clock the next morning, having put the station to air on its first night. I went home from that interview as the operations manager, and knowing as much about the station as anyone else, because it was literally a day old at the time. It was a fascinating time to work here, because all the passions that had seen Armstrongs develop into the largest recording studio complex in Melbourne, all of those passions were alive and well, and currently plying their craft. Bill Armstrong was still actively involved in the company. Ern Rose was here, Ian McKenzie, Ross Cockle, Phil Webster, Doug Davies,
Tim Button.
Yeah, the old Bank Street gang.
Yep.
And so it was great. It was a great time to be involved. It was also at the era when the recording studio industry was probably about to burst into its peak. But enigmatically, it was also the time that the new regime was taking over within the building. So it was a time of transition between the old gang that had built Armstrongs around a reputation of we'll do whatever it takes, to really more of an engineering-based, video-based facility as set up by David Simon Company. During the first stay that I was here, which was from 77 to 79, Jojo Zek and the Falcons recorded here. Skyhooks had just finished an album. Little River Band had just finished an album. Renee Gayer did Ready to Deal. Ern Rose was doing some interesting things with some way out people, a guy called Captain Rock.
Right, okay.
Captain Matchbox
Yep.
recorded here. When I first arrived here, this was prior to any concert control room being anywhere in Australia at the time. So it was the original Octro console and a room that was quite nicely put together, but didn't have any of the active tracking or anything like that. I actually came back here to manage audio. Roger asked, because Bernie Rose had gone to run Flagstaff Studios, and Roger was busy doing film sound work and didn't want to get involved in the politics of re-establishing the audio studios at the forefront of the industry as they had been, but had over a couple of years fallen behind because everyone else had rebuilt and re-equipped, and that had left AAV a bit old hat really.
Yep.
And the new regime that had come into the place didn't really want to put much energy into audio.
Yep.
They actually wouldn't have cared less of it. It'd actually fall over and died, because really they were a video. First of all, they didn't want to put any money into actually redeveloping the studio. So I took on marketing that idea that intrinsic to the name of AAV was its roots, which was Bill Armstrong, and that therefore was audio.
Yep.
And that if you were to take that away from the company, you would remove the backbone of it really.
Yep.
And that the video section would then need to establish an identity on its own footing without anything else, and that was a separate undertaking in its own right. Mm-hmm. So I put forward the idea that it would be well worth their while to actually to look after the roots of where the company had come from
Yep.
and to re-establish it. Leon Hill, who was the CEO at the time, understood that and went into bat for that with Ronald McDonald, who was the then CEO of David's Home.
Yep.
He agreed, and then we set about the business of determining what sort of console, what sort of room design and that sort of thing. The engineering section, those upstairs, wanted an MCI console and MCI machines, purely and simply because every other studio had one, and their rationale was there will be no problem with spare parts. Our approach, that is the engineers, Roger and myself, was to take the opposite tack and push for something entirely different, because we felt that if we were going to re-establish the studio in its rightful place at the head of the pack, we would do that by making it exciting and different, and not by duplicating what everyone else had done. Alan Eaton's was taking over with commercial production, and Flagstaff was starting to do some really interesting stuff, or had done some interesting stuff, but were starting to eat into our market a bit more. Platinum Recorders were developing a bit of a presence, a bit more of a presence than we'd like, and Richmond Recorders had just started up, and Ian McKenzie had left AAV and gone round there, half as a staff person and half as a freelancer, but kind of based himself from Richmond Recorders. So they were really the main opposition at the time. The studio had been 24 track probably for 12 months at that stage. We were using Optro 24 track machines. The politics of the place, as I say, were changing. It was a transition from that idea of a kind of a homegrown entity, you know, local studio makes good kind of thing, to something that had probably more aligned with ABC kind of thinking, where there was a strategic approach to things rather than a let's do what we need to do at the time. And I think that's probably the best way to sum it up. I think it's probably fair to say that there was a certain intolerance from the new video/engineering crowd to the way the audio department was wired, for example, and the way that equipment had been chosen, you know, and the way things had been done, you know. I found it frustrating because I think a lot of the magic of what creates great audio work is that spontaneity and improvisation. I don't think you can just buy a set of gear and expect to turn out great work. You've also got to have a passion, and you've got to have a vision, and you've got to be able to hear things differently and do things differently on the spur of the moment. And I think that, you know, the people that worked in the audio section gained a lot of knowledge from producers that were brought in from overseas at that time, because the money was there to do that. And the engineering department didn't understand any of that, you know. If it wasn't infinitely replicable, and that, you know, anyone that had a degree in something or other, you know, should be able to walk in and produce exactly the same result as anyone else that had a degree in that area, you know. It was just a different way of thinking. Look, it's not that one was right and one was wrong. It's just that I think that the audio mentality was out of place in amongst the video people, just the same as the video mentality was out of place amongst the audio people. Ted Gregory was director of video at that stage. Leon Hill, as I say, was CEO. Lance Pink was director of engineering. Roger Savage was director of audio. And I came in as manager of audio. Yeah, they were the key players in the battle.